Grace Morgan sat at the edge of her worn-out sofa, her eyes fixed on the empty formula can sitting amid the clutter of the coffee table. The faint hum of the old refrigerator filled the tiny apartment, like a cruel reminder of how fragile everything she was holding on to had become. In the next room, little Sophie, her daughter, slept soundly, her face serene and untouched by the struggles her mother fought through every single day. With trembling hands, Grace unlocked her phone and typed a desperate message to her best friend, Nora Bennett. Nora, could I borrow a little money to buy Sophie some milk? Just until payday. I'm sorry for asking again. Her heart clenched as she hit send. It wasn't the first time she had to ask for help, and the weight of poverty pressed down on her like an unending storm. But seconds later, as she glanced at the screen, her blood turned to ice. The message hadn't gone to Nora. It had been sent to Alexander Kane. Alexander, her ex-husband, the man who had left her 4 years ago and risen to become a tech billionaire, gracing the covers of Forbes, striding through glittering galas while she struggled to afford baby formula. The man who once promised her forever and left her with nothing but broken pieces. Panic flooded through her. Grace's fingers shook as she quickly typed, "I'm sorry, wrong person. Please ignore this message." But before she could gather herself, the screen lit up again. A new message appeared, cold, concise, and commanding. "Wait for me." "I'm coming." Grace froze, her pulse hammering in her chest. "No, it can't be," she whispered, fumbling to type another explanation. Then another notification flashed across the screen, this time from her bank app, a transfer of $1 million from the corporate account of Alexander Kane. Her breath caught. $1 million? For a message sent by mistake? A knock thundered against the door. Sharp, urgent, relentless. The world around her spun. Grace rose on unsteady feet and opened it with shaking hands. And there he was, Alexander Kane, standing tall in a perfectly tailored suit, eyes cold yet impossibly deep. He filled the doorway like a storm contained in human form. "Grace," he said, his voice low, gravelly, controlled yet powerful. "We need to talk." The air in the small apartment grew thick, heavy, electric. Grace couldn't speak. The man who had once shattered her life was now back, bringing with him another storm she might not survive. The tiny apartment seemed to shrink as Alexander stepped inside. The chill from outside followed him in, mingling with the faint, expensive scent of his Armani suit. Grace closed the door behind him, her palms slick with cold sweat. He stood in the center of the living room, his sharp eyes scanning everything. The old sofa, the cluttered coffee table, the faded walls. It was a world completely foreign to the one he lived in. But what made him freeze wasn't the poverty. It was the small baby crib in the corner, draped with a pale pink blanket. Grace instantly moved to block his view, her voice trembling but firm. "You shouldn't be here. Leave, Alexander." His gaze slowly lifted to her face, tired, hollow, yet still proud. Then in a low, weighted tone, he asked, "Is it a boy or a girl?" "Grace, is that our child?" The words hit her like a blade to the chest. She took a step back, arms folding over herself as if to build a fragile shield. "Don't. This isn't your concern." Alexander advanced a step closer, the deep blue in his eyes glinting with accusation and restrained anger. "Don't lie to me. I have a right to know. Sophie, she's mine, isn't she?" The air turned heavy, almost suffocating. Grace clenched her fists, forcing her voice to stay steady. "You lost that right the day you walked away. Sophie is mine. I don't need your pity, and I don't need you showing up out of nowhere to disrupt her life." Something flickered in Alexander's eyes. Pain, fleeting but real, before it was buried again under his familiar icy composure. He tilted his head slightly, voice low and cutting as steel. "You can erase me from your life, Grace, but you will not erase me from my daughter's." Grace's breath caught, her heart pounding wildly. The small apartment had become a battlefield, between the limitless power of a billionaire and the fierce, desperate resolve of a mother protecting her child. When the door closed behind Alexander, the apartment sank back into a heavy, suffocating silence. Grace stood motionless for a long moment, her chest rising and falling rapidly, her trembling hands clasped tightly together. It wasn't until she heard Sophie stir softly in the bedroom that she managed to move again. Quietly, she pulled the pink blanket over her daughter and watched the child's peaceful face, a deep ache swelling inside her chest, an ache too complex to name. She sank onto the worn-out sofa, staring into the dim emptiness of the room. For a fleeting moment, the fear that had gripped her earlier gave way to a slow-burning anger. Anger at herself for wavering when she saw him, and anger at fate for forcing her to fight alone. But when Sophie's tiny hand twitched in her sleep, Grace's expression softened. She smiled faintly. As long as her baby was safe, she could endure anything. Across the city, Alexander sat in his luxurious penthouse, the Manhattan skyline glowing through the vast pane of glass behind him. A glass of whiskey gleamed in his hand, but the familiar burn of it brought no comfort tonight. His mind replayed every image of that cramped apartment, the peeling walls, the pink baby blanket, and Grace's eyes, eyes that seemed to reject him and plead with him all at once. He leaned back in his chair, feeling something he hadn't felt in years, a loss of control. Alexander Kane, the man who could close billion-dollar deals with a single nod, was shaken to his core by a woman and a child. Sophie. The name echoed in his mind, sharp as a blade, cutting into the pride he'd always believed untouchable. He had left Grace behind, but he couldn't ignore the truth that now loomed before him. That little girl might be his. Between two worlds, one a small apartment built on courage and sacrifice, the other a glass tower of wealth and power, an invisible thread had formed. And both Grace and Alexander knew one thing for certain. There was no going back to the way things once were. Grace sat alone in her small apartment, the dim yellow glow of an old lamp casting long shadows across the room. Her eyes stared blankly into the void as memories surged back like a storm, pulling her into the final days of a marriage that once seemed unbreakable. Back then, they still lived in Alexander's luxurious penthouse. Every evening, Grace would set the table, hoping for just one quiet, intimate dinner together. But Alexander always came home late, briefcase in one hand, laptop in the other. He would sit down, open his emails, and disappear into his world of deals and deadlines, as if everything beyond those screens mattered more than she ever could. One night, as candlelight flickered against the crystal glasses, Grace gathered every ounce of courage she had and whispered her simplest dream. "Alex, I want us to have a baby." The fork in his hand froze midair. Alexander looked up, his eyes cold, his voice flat and precise. "A baby? Grace, do you have any idea what that would do? Blackwood Tech is expanding. I can't afford distractions. A child right now is out of the question." The words cut straight through her heart. The fragile smile faded from her lips, leaving behind a silence so heavy it filled the entire room. From that night on, she never mentioned having children again. But fate has a cruel sense of irony. Months later, Grace found herself staring at a pregnancy test in the bathroom mirror, her hands trembling, tears streaming down her face. Joy and fear collided inside her chest, because she knew that, to Alexander, a baby would be nothing but a liability. In the weeks that followed, the penthouse grew even colder. Alexander either didn't notice the change in her or chose to ignore it. He drowned himself in billion-dollar negotiations, while she carried a growing secret, both precious and terrifying. And then one rainy night, when Alexander returned from yet another lavish gala, Grace quietly placed the divorce papers on the table. There were no tears, no shouting, just the sound of quiet resignation. "I don't want anything," she said softly. "I just want to leave." She walked out of that penthouse with nothing, no money, no title, no husband. But she carried something far more valuable, a new life growing inside her. That night, beneath the pounding rain, Grace made a vow. If she had to choose between Alexander's cold love and a simple life with her child, she would choose her child every time. And that choice led her here, a life of struggle and solitude. Yes, but one filled with quiet strength, courage, and a kind of love she had never known before. After that night of memories, Grace's life returned to its slow, quiet rhythm. But on the other side of the city, Alexander Kane was no longer the same man. Inside the top-floor office of Blackwood Tech, The lights of Manhattan glimmered against the massive glass wall, illuminating the silhouette of a sleepless man. Alexander stood before the window, gripping a folder tightly in his hand, his eyes fixed on the sea of city lights below. That world, once his playground, his empire, suddenly felt meaningless compared to the question haunting his mind. Sophie? Is she my daughter? He couldn't stand the uncertainty any longer. A man who had built $1 billion empire from nothing could not allow himself to live in the shadow of an unanswered question, especially one tied to blood, to family, to something that had once been love. He opened a drawer and pulled out a thick folder, the report from the private investigation firm he had hired that very night. Each page he turned tightened the knot in his chest. Grace Hayes. After the divorce, she left everything behind. Took no settlement, no financial support. She moved into a rundown apartment in Queens, working part-time jobs to make ends meet. No records of financial ties to him, no transactions from Blackwood Tech. Nothing. And then one page stopped his breath. A child born 3 years ago. Name, Sophie. Alexander sank into his chair, running a hand through his hair. A storm of emotions crashed inside him. Rage at himself for abandoning her, fury at Grace for hiding the truth, and a fierce, aching need to reclaim what was lost. He whispered into the cold silence of his vast office. She's my daughter. Grace, you can't keep her from me. And in that moment, a decision crystallized, sharp and absolute, like every business deal he had ever closed. Alexander Kane would fight to reclaim his right as a father, no matter the cost. From that night on, the battlefield would no longer be the boardroom. It would be the fragile intersection of love, guilt, and redemption, where a man used to winning everything would have to face the one truth money could never buy. In the days that followed, Grace's life seemed to move along its usual rhythm. Quiet, predictable, almost calm. But deep inside, a silent storm had begun to rise. Alexander was back, not just through the piercing look in his eyes, but through a relentless determination to reclaim his right as a father. And Grace knew. The fragile peace she'd built for herself and Sophie was slipping away. That evening, under a drizzle, after another long shift at the restaurant, Grace sat alone in the small kitchen corner, exhaustion weighing heavily on her shoulders. The hum of the refrigerator was the only sound, until a soft clink broke the silence. Julian Scott, the restaurant manager, set a steaming cup of tea in front of her. "You look exhausted, Grace," he said gently, his voice deep and calm. She looked up and met his gaze, steady, kind, without judgment. He didn't press for answers, didn't offer empty advice. He simply sat nearby, his presence warm enough to melt the tension in her chest. Julian was nothing like Alexander. No tailored suits, no commanding voice, no eyes sharp enough to cut through a boardroom. Instead, there was patience, quiet, genuine care. The kind of tenderness Grace had once dreamed of in marriage but never received. In that quiet moment, a thought flickered through her mind. If life hadn't been so cruel, maybe Julian was the kind of man she had always needed. Someone who shared her burdens instead of turning love into a battlefield for control. But across the city, Alexander Kane was not a man who knew how to yield. One rainy evening, he arrived at the restaurant to pick Grace up, only to freeze when he saw Julian holding an umbrella over her, shielding her from the downpour. Grace laughed softly, a rare, delicate smile that cut straight through him. From a distance, Alexander watched, his jaw tightening. The green in his eyes darkened with a quiet, burning jealousy. He didn't say a word, but inside a storm brewed. He knew then that this wasn't just about fatherhood anymore. It wasn't just about Sophie. Julian Scott had become something far more dangerous. The man who could give Grace everything Alexander once denied her. And from that moment on, the battle ahead would no longer be fought in courtrooms or contracts, but in the uncharted territory of the heart. The quiet tension that had been simmering for weeks finally erupted into a confrontation. That night, after another long shift, Grace stepped out of the restaurant, clutching her worn handbag, ready to cross the rain-soaked street. But before she could call a taxi, a tall, familiar figure blocked her path. Alexander Kane, his dark hair glistening with rain, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked carved from stone. "We need to talk," he said, voice low and hoarse, every word sharp as a blade. Grace froze for a heartbeat, then lifted her chin. Her eyes hardened with quiet resolve. "There's nothing left to say, Alexander. You left. My life. My daughter's life. They don't belong to you anymore." The words hit him like a strike to the chest. His nostrils flared. He took a step closer, fists tightening at his sides. "Don't fool yourself, Grace. I walked away from you, but I never walked away from my child. Sophie, I have the right to be her father." Under the dim amber of the streetlight, Grace stood her ground, one hand instinctively pressed against her chest, as if shielding the part of her that still ached, the same part that had chosen to keep her baby no matter the cost. "Being a father isn't about power, Alexander," she said softly, each word cutting through the rain. "It's not a deal you can win with money or status. Being a father is showing up. It's sleepless nights. It's wiping away tears. And in all those moments, where were you?" Alexander faltered. For the first time, the icy facade cracked, and a flicker of pain crossed his eyes. But before he could answer, a calm, steady voice rose from behind Grace. "Is there a problem here?" Julian Scott. He strode toward them, tall and composed, his dark hair slick with rain, his gaze steady and protective. Grace turned slightly, just enough to meet Julian's eyes, and in that glance she felt the weight in her chest lift, just a little. Alexander's expression hardened. His blue eyes narrowed, sizing Julian up. "And who are you," he asked coldly, "to interfere in my family's affairs?" Julian didn't flinch. His tone was measured, calm, but the steel beneath it was unmistakable. "I'm just someone who doesn't like seeing Grace cornered. If you truly want to be a father, start by respecting her, not by turning her life into a battlefield." The street fell silent except for the rhythm of falling rain. 3 people stood there, each carrying their own truth. Grace, the fierce mother, fighting to protect her child from the chaos she escaped. Julian, the quiet balance embodying the tenderness she once longed for. Alexander, the powerful man forced to face a truth he could never control. Not everything can be owned. But in that storm-lit moment, another truth surfaced, one that would change everything. Clutched in Alexander's hand was a folded set of documents, medical records, proof that Grace had visited a prenatal clinic just before their divorce, which meant one devastating possibility. Sophie might have been conceived while they were still married. His grip on the papers tightened, veins visible beneath wet skin. His voice trembled. Part rage, part heartbreak. "You lied to me, Grace. Why? Why did you hide her from me?" The rain came down harder, drowning the silence between them. Grace's breath hitched. She knew then, whatever peace she had tried to build was gone. Because from this moment on, the real battle had just begun. The sound of rain still echoed faintly somewhere in the distance, but for Grace it was now only a blur in her memory. After that stormy confrontation, the following days were a blur of exhaustion and quiet dread. Her body ached from long shifts, her mind frayed between Alexander's relentless pursuit and Julian's quiet, watchful concern. Then it happened, on a night that began like any other. Inside her small Queens apartment, Grace doubled over, clutching her stomach as a wave of pain tore through her. Cold sweat trickled down her temples. She tried to steady herself, reaching for her phone, but her hands shook violently. From the bedroom, a soft, frightened voice called out, "Mommy?" Grace bit her lip, forcing her trembling voice to sound steady. "I'm okay, sweetheart. Go back to sleep." But she knew. This time she wasn't okay. Across the city in a glass tower high above Manhattan, Alexander Kane had just stepped out of a high-stakes board meeting. As the final signatures in were a billion-dollar deal, his phone suddenly buzzed. A panicked voice burst through the line. "Mr. Kane! I'm Grace's neighbor. She's in pain. Really bad pain. She won't call 911. I didn't know what else to do but call you." For a second, Alexander couldn't move. Every ounce of power, every polished speech, every number in his empire vanished into nothing. He said only one thing. "Stay with her. I'm coming. His car tore through the rain-soaked streets. When he finally burst into Grace's apartment, the scene before him nearly stopped his heart. Grace lay collapsed on the old sofa, pale as moonlight, her lips bitten until they bled. She looked up weakly, her voice barely a whisper. Alex, don't let Sophie see. Alexander's throat tightened. He didn't hesitate. He scooped her into his arms. For the first time, the man who had once treated emotions like weakness felt just how fragile life really was, and how cruel his choices had been. The hospital hallways were flooded with harsh, sterile light. The rhythmic echo of rushing footsteps and medical orders blurred around him. When the nurses wheeled Grace away, her trembling hand reached for his, one last tether between two worlds that had never truly fit together. Alexander held on tight, his voice breaking but firm. I'm here. I'm not leaving this time. The sound of sirens, the sharp clang of metal instruments, the pounding of his own heart, and then a cry, thin, soft, but unmistakably alive. Time froze. Sophie was safe, and through the glass he saw Grace, pale, drained, but with a faint, peaceful glow in her eyes. That night, the night of pain, fear, and near loss, was more than a crisis. It was Alexander Kane's awakening. For the man who once believed the world could be owned, that night taught him a truth he could never unlearn. All the money, power, and empires in the world meant nothing if he couldn't hold on to them. The pale morning light filtered softly through the hospital's white curtains. The room was quiet, save for the steady rhythm of the heart monitor echoing in the still air. Grace lay on the bed, her face still pale after the night's ordeal, her eyes fixed on Sophie, who slept peacefully in the bassinet beside her. Across from them, Alexander sat slouched in a chair, his hands clasped tightly together as if in prayer. The dark circles under his eyes told of a sleepless night. Gone was the composed, commanding billionaire. What remained was a man hollowed out by fear and guilt. Grace's voice broke the silence, raspy but resolute. You shouldn't be here, Alex. This isn't your place. Alexander looked up, her words slicing through him. But this time he didn't fight back. He just exhaled slowly, voice low and fragile. I walked away from you once, and almost lost my daughter too. I can't make that mistake again. Grace turned her gaze toward Sophie, her chest tightening with conflicting emotions. She remembered his eyes from the night before. Not the cold, possessive stare she once knew, but the desperate look of a man terrified of losing what truly mattered. The door creaked open. Julian Scott entered, carrying a basket of fruit, his presence calm but firm. He nodded to Grace, his expression soft, until his eyes met Alexander's. The air thickened instantly. You seem to forget, Julian said evenly. Grace needs rest. Not pressure. Alexander rose to his feet, shoulders tense, his tone measured but unwavering. I'm not here to pressure her. I'm here for my daughter. And for Grace. A heavy silence hung between them. Grace closed her eyes, her heart torn in two, between the pride that once broke her and the peace she longed for. Alexander's fist clenched, his voice dropping into something almost like a plea. Grace, you can hate me. You don't have to forgive me. But Sophie, you can't take me away from her. I'll prove myself, not with money, but by being here. I'm not leaving again. Grace opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. In them shimmered both fear and a faint, fragile glimmer of hope. It's easy to say that, Alex, she whispered, but do you have the patience to stay this time? The question lingered in the sterile white air, fragile, unresolved, but powerful. And for the first time, Alexander Kane, the man who had once owned everything, finally understood. To hold on to his family, he would have to learn to wait and to change. The afternoon sky was painted in soft shades of amber, the fading sunlight spilling gently through the trees in the small park near the hospital. A breeze carried the mingling sounds of children's laughter and birdsong, the quiet symphony of an ordinary, peaceful evening. On a wooden bench by the lake, Grace sat beside Sophie, gently adjusting the little hat on her daughter's head. Sophie giggled, clutching her mother's fingers, then pointed excitedly toward the man standing a few steps away. Alexander. He wasn't dressed like the powerful billionaire the world knew. No tailored suit, no commanding presence. Just a simple white shirt, jeans, and a pair of deep blue eyes watching his daughter's every move. When Sophie softly called, "Daddy!" Alexander's shoulders trembled. He walked over, sat beside them, and for the first time in years, the silence between them didn't feel like a wall, just space filled with unspoken memories. Grace said nothing. The air between them was no longer sharp with resentment, yet the ghosts of the past still lingered. Alexander forced a small smile, offering his hand for Sophie to hold. His voice was low, warm, and rough around the edges. "You're everything to me, sweetheart. And so is your mom." The words hung in the air, fragile and sincere. Grace's chest tightened. She turned toward him, her eyes cautious but no longer cold. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to believe that maybe his change was real. Not born from guilt or power, but from sleepless nights in hospital corridors, from trembling hands holding a newborn, from the raw look of regret in his eyes. "Alex," she murmured, her voice barely above the wind, "I believe in change, but it takes time." Alexander nodded, silent. There was no defense, no negotiation, only acceptance. This wasn't a deal to be closed. It was a journey to be earned. One small act, one honest day at a time. From a distance, Julian Scott stood beneath the orange light of dusk, watching quietly. His eyes were calm, though shadowed with a quiet sorrow. He understood. Some battles aren't meant to be won by presence, but by stepping back and letting destiny decide. And so, under the fading glow of the sunset, three souls, each burdened by their own wounds, hopes, and choices, sat within the same frame of light. No one knew what the future would bring, but one thing was certain. Their story wasn't over. It was only the beginning of a new chapter, where love, hope, and forgiveness would decide the ending. The story of Grace, Alexander, and Sophie is more than just a tale of lost love rediscovered. It's a profound reminder of the power of presence and patience. Alexander, the once untouchable billionaire who believed everything could be bought, is forced to face the truth. Love and family aren't transactions. They demand sacrifice, daily care, and, above all, the courage to stay when it matters most. Grace, the woman who seemed fragile, proved the quiet, unstoppable strength of a mother. She chose protection over prestige, showing that a mother's love can outlast any storm life throws her way. And Julian, the man on the periphery, became the mirror of simple kindness. He showed that love doesn't always mean possession. Sometimes it's just the gentle act of being there when someone needs peace. Final lessons. Power and money can never replace love. A family doesn't need grand promises, only genuine presence. Forgiveness and change are never easy, but when they come from the heart, they can begin a brand new chapter. And that is the story of Grace, Alexander, and Sophie. A journey of love, loss, and awakening. He was a man who once had everything, yet lost the one thing that truly mattered: family. And she, the woman left behind, became the embodiment of strength, resilience, and grace, something no amount of money could ever buy. So tell me, if you were Grace, would you give Alexander a second chance? Or are there wounds that even time itself can never heal? Share your thoughts below, because perhaps the real answer lies not in the story, but in the heart of each of us.